So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is another map that I don't believe we have shown before, another cityscape style map, a little bit more simplistic than the ones we've seen up to this point, but it has the feel actually of a map that was made some time ago, so maybe I did show it off at one point in the past, but certainly I don't remember it. This sort of very strange terrain outside of the settlement, large sweeping hills and the river over in the distance as well, albeit I think in actual terms I don't think we'll be seeing too much of that. Might see a little bit of cavalry play out on the slopes, but for the most part it will be within the settlement, and to be fair to the defenders, the slope also exists within it, so it's going to be a real uphill slog for the attackers to try and get all the way to the summit of this particular settlement. I don't think this one is a lore-friendly one either. We've got Numenor, Rhun, who I suppose could fight side by side, but I think they're alongside Dwarves of the Blue Mountains. You could say that these are some of the greediest factions in Middle-earth, potentially. That's maybe the only thing that I can think of to attribute to this battle, but we'll go through the attackers first and foremost, starting off with Colonel Speaks 46, who's going to be playing as the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. I've seen them a little bit recently, and they're never really going to change in terms of what they offer to a force that they're fighting with. Numbers is obviously the name of the game, and they can deploy them pretty effectively, interlacing some little advantages like a bit of armor piercing here and there, a few monstrous units to make up for the fact that most of their mainline units, if they get isolated, are going to struggle to win out in any fair fight, but the Misty Mountains, you're going to be wanting to make every fight one that you have an advantage in numbers in. Moria Spearguard, though, for what they are a pretty decent unit, decent enough defensively considering there are 253 of them. A little bit more venom in those spears as well than you might expect from a unit of this calibre. We've got cave trolls in here as well, of course, with their slightly tighter formation. If you do need to bash your way through a front line quickly, the cave trolls will allow you to do that, but they do of course have less survivability than pretty much every other troll that is meant for sustained combat. So we'll see how they get on, especially against factions like the Dwarves and the Numenorians. White Orc Fearmongers, we saw them be pretty effective in the recent Orcish Ruins defensive siege, indeed to the extent that they were able to hold off against similar tier pike units, interestingly enough, but they were on the defence that time. This time they're going to have to try and wade their way through into an attacking position. Heavy Goblin Crossbows, again, terrain and sight lines are always going to be very, very important for crossbows, but if you're the attackers and you bring them and you land even a few decent volleys, it's something which the defenders very often struggle to come back from. So we'll see if the Heavy Goblin Crossbows can get into that good position. I think it's less the fact that there's not a huge amount of cover in the settlement really, but the terrain may make it a little bit more difficult for the crossbows to get the ideal firing angle. We shall see. Goblin Kingsguard, of course, a relatively basic unit of bodyguard infantry, but fairly numerous for what they are. Not many sword and board bodyguard units have 83 by standard, but 84 with the general. Obviously the Misty Mountains have got that new general model now as well. More Moria Spearguard, and there will be more goblins skulking around in the undergrowth as well. Cave Troll Drummers will help keep them in line. We have Rhudaur, played by T.S. Niehoff. I think, honestly, Rhudaur have got the similar sort of survivability problems to the Misty Mountains. They're not quite as numerous, but they do have a significant amount more punch in melee through various means. Not so really with the Rhudaur Swordsmen. They're, again, just a sort of basic unit, decent enough for the cost, but of course if you compare them to many of the other Western kingdoms, the armour and overall equipment is going to be what really puts them a tier lower than many of their contemporaries. Arthedain Pikemen are a very good unit, however, for what they are. The shields mean that they at least mitigate one of the main weaknesses that pikes tend to have against archers, which, especially when you're on the attack like this, can make all the difference in the world over a long period of time. And in melee as well, they're generally pretty damn good. They tend to do a decent amount of damage for a pike unit, which does track with what Rhudaur tend to be all about anyway. Barbarian Catapult is here, again, considering slightly more limited cover in the settlement. Attacking artillery could be really, really useful, but we already briefly saw some defending artillery, which with the terrain they should be looking to snipe out any sort of artillery the attackers have pretty sharpish. Some javelins in and amongst there as well. The Attenmore's Troll Hunters, completely unsurprising of course, decently solid in melee as well thanks to that armour of theirs, but javelins in general are one thing that Rhudaur very, very rarely go without. We've got the Arthedain nobles in here as well with the armour upgrade. Fantastic unit of lance cavalry, maybe a little bit lacking in the defensive department, but then that tracks with Rhudaur as a faction on the whole. Rhudaur marksman just in behind the Witch Realm Enslavers, of course, a fantastic unit wielding those wicked tridents. More Arthedain pikemen, lots of Rhudaur swordsmen here, so going with them instead of the slightly less numerous but maybe slightly tankier Rhudaur clansmen. But yeah, that's going to be what makes up the vast majority of their army. Moving on, we have the Rhovanion, played by Red Knight. The Rhovanion, interesting sort of faction. Again, they're one of those that has a very distinct split between their tribal units and their more heavily armoured upper crust units, if you will. I think in many ways, though, the Rhovakin archers, again, they could get into a good position to skirmish. They're very good in terms of their armour. We've got the Rhovakin nobles, again. Sword and board bodyguard units have a tendency to be that dependable sort of unit, but they're never really going to blow you away in terms of the amount of kills they get generally. We do see occasionally units like this get tons and tons of kills, but I don't think that's going to be the case this time, especially not on the attack anyway. Tribal levy slingers, the throwing units of all of these tribals. We've got skirmishers and slingers with javelins and those slings. I think, again, if they can get into a good position, decent amount of damage, it's the sort of thing the defenders may struggle a bit with. The tribal berserker is very important to the Rhovanion. It might be the most important unit in their roster, to be honest, because it's the only way they can really do enhanced levels of damage with melee infantry. The rest of their higher end infantry tends to be more defensive in nature, so you're going to be wanting to do a bit of damage, and especially with those Falxers, to try and peel through the defensive layers that in particular Numenor and the dwarves will have. Rhovakin Hoplons, an example of that defensive focus on some of their higher tier units. So tanky, but they will struggle to do damage with that Spear Malice, even though they are a decent enough unit. You are talking about in Numenor and the Blue Mountains, even Rhun to a certain extent, factions that have got the defensive abilities to be able to mitigate that damage nicely. Rhovakin Phalanx, very similar to the Arthedain nobles we mentioned before, only even better, because they twin the shield with having better armour in general, although I think they are a little bit more expensive, so that is the trade-off. Some standard tribal levy spears, and the Rhoveran nobles, another unit of very dangerous, fast-moving lance cavalry. And finally, last but by no means least, Tintin, playing as Arthedain. Arthedain man-at-arms with the full levels of armour upgrades, so the numbers of the Misty Mountains, and then the good armour of the higher-end Rhovanion units, and then the generally good defensive setup of Arthedain's mid-tiers and more basic units. That's a good mix for an attacking force to keep yourselves going. And then you've got the tribals of Rhudaur and the Rhovanion as well to do the damage. So a good mix, especially with the full plate armour that not only the man-at-arms but also the Arthedain pikemen have been furnished with. Give them that little bit of extra survivability when it comes to dealing with any ranged fire, which they will undoubtedly encounter given the terrain disadvantage they're at. Defenders of Fornost could be very, very strong in melee, particularly against the likes of Rhun. Good melee defense and good damage in return. Standard Arthedain spears as well, so going for more of a rank and file kind of army this Arthedain, but more numbers for the attackers is always a useful thing for them, as we've learned many times before. And standard Arthedain marksman with the full armour upgrades as well. Good for skirmishing. Then down here the general is going to be in the Wardens of the North. If they can get into a good position, of course, another very dangerous attacking skirmisher. Doubtless as well, as much as this is a fairly sizable army, there's almost certainly going to be some Dunedain skulking around as well. So we move on to the defenders. Tommy, who is the one who sent me this battle replay, so a big thank you to him, is playing as the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains, who are very adept defenders. The High Thanes of Azaghal, probably been the most impressive unit every time we've seen the Blue Mountains take to the field. Very strong javelins and then halberds in melee means that they're an awkward kind of unit to deal with because of the damage they can do before you even get into melee with them. They're kind of similar to, ironically, the Proudfoot Protectors of the Shire, being pikes and crossbows, in the sense that it's kind of a unique mix, and it tends to serve them very well. Crossspears of Azaghal, these repeaters, which are again completely unique to them at the moment, very, very dangerous if they can get continuous fire going. We'll see if they can get the right sight lines as well. The terrain might help them, or it might make things a little bit more difficult with how steep it is, but we'll see. A couple of units of the Juggernauts in terms of pure melee potential. This is the best unit that the Blue Mountains have to offer. Very, very strong, huge defensive values as well when you combine the armour with the added melee defense of a dual-wielding unit. Several units of Dwarven Miners to pad the roster out a little bit. They'll struggle, but they're just here to make up the numbers. some defenders, so basic dwarven spears, marksmen of Thorin's halls as well. I mean, they are going to have to engage in some sort of skirmishing, I would imagine, the defenders, but the Blue Mountains are one of the better factions in the game at dealing with that kind of pressure. Durin's Warborn, the Boar Cavalry, which is the strongest unit of cav that the Blue Mountains have to offer. Like any of this dwarven cavalry that you tend to see in this game, it has a pretty crunching charge, but it does tend to be maybe a little bit less versatile, a little bit less speedy than some of the offerings from other factions. And then we have the Wardens of Thorin's Halls as well, another dual-wielding unit, a more basic option than the Juggernauts, of course, but still the same theories apply. Big armor values, combined with the melee defense of a dual wielder, makes them a very, very tough nut to crack in pure melee terms. Then we have Rhun, the central faction here, played by Hidden. Carmel's Chosen, very similar to the Rovakin Nobles, the Goblins Bodyguard, and all of that we've already seen. Basic, as far as a bodyguard unit can be basic in terms of a sword and board. But yeah, I do like the enhanced look on these guys as well. It makes them look far more resplendent. Golden Raiders. We've seen a little bit actually of these mounted crossbowmen cropping up more and more in these battle replays as time goes on, and that's of course because the punch that crossbows offer can be very, very useful, and the added manoeuvrability means that you're not going to get caught cold quite so easily, but they can be counter-skirmished down fairly simply. Valkos Sapphire Bladesman, Dragon's Wrath Guildsman, Carmel's Shadow Guard, all of the high damage runic units up close and further away. Gamprim, Scion Rim and Flag Rim. The triumvirate of runic units which make up any of their solid front lines really, especially when you've got a little bit of extra cash to play with in a 3v4 like this. You're going to want to pad it out with the quality, and of course that armor piercing that Rhun are known for as well is going to be useful against certain elements of the attackers today. We also have some Carmel's Shadow Bows up here, some Tribesmen Dragon's Wrath crossbows, which have been decent lately, but maybe in comparison to other specialty projectile units they always flatter to deceive a little bit. We'll see if they can really get things going here. And of course the Dragon's Breath, which I think will be looking to try and snipe out that attacking catapult early, but we shall see. And some Carmel's Immortals as well, who show up pretty much every single time as well. For a basic entry level unit, as long as you don't get them shot up too badly because of their lack of a shield, they can be very efficient in melee as well. That dual wielding, which we already spoke about with Ered Luin. And finally, we have Joey Wan Kenobi playing as Numenor, another high quality faction of course in terms of heavy infantry. If they can get themselves situated on these slopes, then they're going to be very difficult to budge. Numenorian cohort at the centre of that, very, very strong unit of line infantry. Of course they have a shield, unlike the Wardens of Thorin's Halls, so the differences between the two. I think in general the shield is always going to be quite useful, especially when you consider factions like Arthedain and the Rhovanion are always going to have some sort of archer presence, so that's going to be useful for them. Belagaya Footman, of course, now have the, well, when you fully upgrade them, it vastly improves their armour score, so they're not going to be the most damaging unit in melee by any stretch of the imagination. Spear Malice and ultimately basic spear damage at best, but defensively they're going to be a real wall, and that's how Numenor are going to be setting up here. Numenor Aru Sentinels, another unit of pikes that have a shield, and we've sort of been stepping up all along in these, well, in this composition phase. The Numenor Aru Sentinels, probably the best example of this that the game has to offer. Very, very thick armour in addition to those shields. They're, well, basically they are actually good at tanking arrow fire as a result of this, which is in stark contrast really to the vast majority of pikes in the game. Steel bows, limited ammunition but good damage, more footmen. Numenorian Shield Guard, of course, a fantastic unit of higher end spears. Very venomous in melee indeed. Pharazim Swordmasters, who I think actually have taken a little, well, in terms of the balancing I think it's still up for debate, but the Pharazim Swordmasters have taken a little bit of a nerf in comparison to how they were in the last version of the game, but I think that's largely by mistake. I'm unsure on that, but they're still very, very strong of course, but maybe not quite the tour de force that they were, but again I think that might be a temporary thing only. A couple of units of Numenorian Shield Guard again. We've got the Numenorian cohort steel bows. I mentioned as well before how it's quite rare that you have a unit of 84 as a bodyguard sword and board unit. The Royal Legion of Armanelos do have that, and of course they are individually significantly stronger than the Goblin King's Guard, so that is a very, very powerful unit in its class indeed. So I will make a little bit of a cut. I don't know how long it's going to take for the attackers to trudge up that hill, and indeed I can't imagine there'll be, well, there won't really need to be too much of a grace period, so it's really just a matter of them getting over that, or cresting the hill and starting to lay siege to this rather intriguing looking settlement. So I'll make a cut, and we'll rejoin when the first blows are being struck. So we'll rejoin here, as battle is now certainly imminent, and I do notice actually there is one example, and it's going to be something which the Orcs of the Misty Mountains are going to be taking immediate advantage of the attackers actually having a superior shooting position to the defenders, which especially on a map like this, when you consider how severe the terrain is kind of unlikely in most maps that you see made. But it is going to be these crossbows who open proceedings up, and it's definitely the sort of position that the attackers could not afford to give up, especially considering they're going to have to cross the bridges over here, which does, at least to a certain extent, dampen the situation they now find themselves in over here. The goblins are going to be taking the lead over on the bridges, and looks like they're going to be going up against Rhun initially, so that armour piercing will crack through the limited defences that the goblins have available to them. Meanwhile, here on the front edge of the settlement, no huge terrain advantage for the defenders initially, but it is an intimidating sight for the attackers when you look at the settlement like this. For each of these Rhudaur swordsmen, it's unlikely that many of them will be alive to reach the summit of this almost a mountainside settlement. This based on how it's laid out. The Rhovanion something forward. They're throwing projectiles to be the first ones to potentially test the dwarven defences as well. Marksman of Thorin's Halls, good shooting position that juts out over here. Another alternative way into the settlement as well. So the bridges on one side and then this sort of mountainside path over on the other does allow the attackers to potentially circumvent going through the centre of the settlement with all of the menace that will likely come with. But for the time being, those crossbows, it was a blank shot as well, so I thought we were about to get underway, but it seems like I was mistaken once more. Goblins, I mean, the troll drummers will help the goblins on this crossing as well, but you would worry for the morale if Rhun were able to really dig into a good position and start doing damage to the goblins quickly. It's a sort of choke point which can really make all the difference. I mean, the Rhovanion and Rhudaur, not the most defensively gifted all round. I mean, the Rhovanion of course do have their Roverkin units, far more resilient than most. It's going to be a numbers game here for the attackers. An army advantage always is very, very useful. Arthedain over on the other side. Let's see how this goes. Numenor, of course, with all the quality. I mean, Numenor and the dwarves in general going to be pretty tough to break them down, you would suggest. I'm wondering what the attackers are waiting for, to be honest. They're all stacked up. They're still very slowly moving through this pass over here. Arthedain going to be the ones to go up against the red line of the map and try their luck against the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. And Arthedain do have a good core of efficient infantry, but when it comes to going toe to toe with the dwarves, they will be exposed a little bit potentially for the lack of damage that they're capable of chucking out, especially in melee against the Blue Mountains, who defensively got plenty of dual wielding units. Defenders of the Blue Mountains ready and waiting. Juggernauts, frost spears as well. I mean, considering the terrain, they should have good opportunities to get some ideal sightlines here, the Blue Mountains dwarves, and those frost spears with their repeaters can be incredibly potent as long as you can consistently get their shots off. They're a very weird kind of unit, actually. Very hard to classify. They're very different to crossbows, but they excel in the same sort of situations. And still nothing. Still we wait. The Misty Mountains now potentially trudging forwards. Going to start going across the bridges. Moria Spearguard. Always the opening gambit for any Misty Mountains army, really, with their slightly better defensive abilities than their contemporaries at the entry level, or the Misty Mountains. And once again, the Misty Mountains fail me in terms of getting the battle underway. They thought about it, and then they thought better of it. Still the Rhovanion, not eager on going in. I really do wonder what they're waiting for. They are now set up and in position, surely they're not waiting for this one unit of goblin infantry to slowly walk its way to the front. I hope they're not doing that. Fatigue isn't going to make the greatest deal of difference to that unit's combat effectiveness, especially not when it's going into an engagement against Rhun, the likes of which will take place on that bridge. So far, still, the angry staring contest between both sides continues. Arthedain, many of them in formation. Nice shield designs there. And at times as well, I mean, it is a big enough army, certainly. Juggernauts, that I do wonder what the deal is with the Juggernauts doing this. They are constantly doing this this animation. And it's been ever since they've been introduced. I know that there was a mini patch recently which did focus on the Blue Mountains. I wonder if this has maintained. Finally. Wardens of the North opening up. Of course, the armor-piercing arrows trying to go after those Juggernauts. They're very, very effective in melee in longer, more drawn-out battles, after all. Marks from the Thorin's Halls. This is probably going to be one of the first times, many a time we've seen the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains, we've made reference to the fact they should be really good in a skirmish fight like this, but we've rarely actually seen them given the opportunity to get involved in this kind of thing. I mean, Arthedain themselves, of course, are pretty damn good at it, but in terms of the quality of units on display, you would back the Blue Mountains here. Marksman over here. Heavy Goblin crossbows. Winded, somehow. I guess climbing up that little incline did take it out of them. Atomor's Troll Hunters on the way forward, and we do have melee engagements springing up now as well, with Carmel's Immortals facing off against the Rhudaur Swordsmen. Victory is a distinct possibility for both sides, so they're feeling good about their chances. Numenorian Shield Guard taking some hits from the Atomor's Troll Hunters. Not ideal for Numenor, that. Every single one of these heavy infantrymen needs to be pulling their weight in melee here. Of course, Rhudaur being chased off now with a little bit of counter-skirmishing, but throwing projectiles for attackers are always something that you can really bring to bear, and of course it is one of the main focuses of Rhudaur as a faction overall. Now they're going to move in to try and deal with this situation quickly. I mean, they will very likely rout off the Rhudaur swordsmen fairly fast, but they are going to take hits as a result of this, and I think Rhudaur would accept losing a unit of Rhudaur swordsmen if it meant doing some pretty significant damage to some of Numenor's better units of infantry. Although the Troll Hunters going for one extra shot, and as a result they are going to get closed up in melee by the Numenorian cohort. Maybe a little bit greedy, that. I mean, they can defend themselves in melee, but they certainly won't be able to defeat the Numenorian cohort. Thinking about moving forward with their Arthedain nobles. I don't know if they have the room to get up to charge speed, and indeed they don't, which will make all the difference. There's no anti-cavalry bonus from the cohort, but if the cavalry doesn't get a charge off, their lower numbers means they can be mobbed and pulled off their mounts pretty effectively. The Troll Hunters still trying to get into a good position to hit those shield guard, which is all well and good, but the cohort moving in, the Rhudaur Axemen now trying to add their armour piercing, trying to play the percentages here, Rhudaur, and doing a decent job of it so far. Numenor is a little bit higgledy-piggledy with regards to how their defence is set up at the moment. On the front here, Tribal Levy Slingers, unsurprisingly. Numenor really bearing the brunt of throwing projectiles so far. As we've already mentioned, I think it is going to be one of the keys to any success the attackers have. Spears thinking about that. Meanwhile, Misty Mountains really coming forward in numbers in a big way. I'm not sure if Rhun were really expecting the Misty Mountains to go this hard this early. Ooh. That is the danger. The Dragon's Breath, one of the Dragon's Breath is hanging off the edge of the cliff. Classic Medieval 2 artillery pathfinding that when you have this sort of terrain. They really ought to install some railings. This sort of thing happens all the time. But a combination of the Dragon's Breath and the Carmel Shadow Bows is probably why the Misty Mountains went all in. It was either a case of try and play the long game, slowly trickle in units and hope that resources favour you in the long run, or try and go really, really aggressive and smash through the runic front lines quickly so you can start pouring into the settlement. And the Misty Mountains have elected for the second one of those two options, but it really opens them up for some serious, serious damage at the hands of the artillery and the rangers. And we're already seeing that. I mean, all of the infantry that was supporting the snow trolls is routed as a result of being crunched by the artillery fire. The snow trolls in and amongst here as well. I mean, normally trolls, we've seen them be very, very effective, but against the armour piercing and damage of the flag rim, but especially the shadow guard, the snow trolls are going to fall away pretty quickly, you'd think. I mean, they are tough, but not as tough as the trolls of Mordor or Isengard, and their increased speed is not going to help them in an engagement like this. But Rhun will be very happy with this, and the Misty Mountains' hyper-aggressive gambit thus far, you would have to say, has certainly not paid off. Oh, they've actually managed to salvage the artillery. I think that's one of the first times I've seen the artillery crew pull it back from the brink. Firing away as they are. Oof. This has been an absolutely vicious beating that the Misty Mountains have taken at the hands of Rhun here. And already, the attackers are going to have to rely on other theatres, I think. I think the Misty Mountains are going to need to take their foot off the gas a bit and simply keep this engagement alive as long as possible, because if they can, if Rhun are allowed to start siphoning off resources to help out their allies, that would be a problem. I mean, to be fair, as much as Rhun have had the better of engagements, we have seen Numenor take some significant hits from throwing projectile units so far, so perhaps a bit of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other so far. And of course defenders, the margin for error is lower when they are outnumbered as they are. I mean, Rhudaur Axemen, as much as the armour piercing will be efficient against Numenor, if they're on their own one-to-one, of course, the low defensive abilities of the Rhudaur Axemen will still be brutally exposed by the Numenorian swordsmen. And those Asimil's Troll Hunters also getting caught permanently in melee by the looks of things. Got a few good volleys off, but they would have been hoping for a little bit more perhaps, and again, those spears will not be sufficient to get the job done. Although over here, interesting little engagement between the Carmel's Immortals and the Rhudaur Swordsmen. I'm actually quite surprised that the Rhudaur Swordsmen have won this. I would assume there was some outside factor at play there, because under normal circumstances I think I would back the Carmel's Immortals in that particular fight, but they've done pretty well. I don't know what they're going to be able to do following on from this. 24 of them effectively in behind enemy lines at this point. And now forward come Rhudaur again, this time probing this position. Belagai footmen fully upgraded as they are. Again, certainly not the most damaging unit, as we've said before, but they make for a very effective metal wall on the front line, getting in the way of their foes. And in a very similar vein are the Rhovakin Hoplons, although the Hoplons at their base are a higher tier unit. The principles are very much the same when you're talking about low damage, high defense spearmen. Neither one of them are going to be doing damage to each other in a hurry. Durin's Warborn. They didn't really get a particularly good charge off there, but the Warborn will still be enough, you would suggest, to bring about the end of this Rhudaur position. I mean, what's going on here? Numenorian Shield Guard routing. Coming forward with extra units, Rhudaur are able to make the difference there. Some of those javelins been thrown way up into the air. I think they were going after the Warborn. Numenor are in a bit of danger here of things spiralling out of control a bit. Tribal Levy Spears still not willing to take the dwarves to task just yet, but this fight has been underway for a little while now, but the first time we're seeing it. Those juggernauts are in there, dwarven miners helping to pad the numbers out, defenders of the Blue Mountains being the core of the defensive effort. And the combination of defenders of Fornost and Arthedain men-at-arms. What is the Fornost actually? That's an interesting one. Is that a... spears anyway. But again, this is the issue. The rank and file of Arthedain are all well and good, but you need to have some quality in here as well, I think, if you're going up against a four-sided dwarves. I mean, especially if the juggernauts are at the centre of this defensive effort, you're going to need some extra support. I mean, if if there is one silver lining, it's the fact that something like the Frost Spears don't have an ideal line of fire, so they're not going to be able to really do the business in the way that maybe the dwarves would want. But they have the edge in melee anyway. It's going to come down to numbers for Arthedain, but the second unit of Juggernauts being added to the front line by Tommy now. So far, no movement will be had by the attackers over there. On the two flanks, it's where they've struggled the most. I mean, as we take a little look at the Misty Mountains again, if there is one thing that the Misty Mountains do have in their favour, it's the fact that because of how big their armies tend to be, they can keep this sort of thing up for longer. Yeah, so far Arthedain and the Misty Mountains struggling to make any sort of ground. It's actually in the middle, right up the gut of the settlement, where Rhovanion and Rhudaur are actually having the most joy of all the attackers, but now the White Orc Fearmongers. I mean, it's a grim situation for Colonel Speaks to be in, I think, when you consider there's only one direction he can go in, and as soon as any sort of pressure is put on, that's when the artillery will start to open up. But that may speak to the fact that maybe the Misty Mountains should have taken the slow approach here. I mean, maybe not, because if that initial attack had come off, I mean, the runic infantry wasn't exactly fully prepared to deal with a full-blooded assault from the Misty Mountains. If they had forced their way through, it could be the sort of thing to make it game set and match the attackers early doors, but you have to say that hasn't panned out, and a bit of friendly fire there. Alkoth tribesmen, they are in danger of actually breaking through on that side, the Misty Mountains. Golden Raiders as well, just in behind, firing away with their bolts. I don't think the Troll Drummers are also not close enough to their infantry units to actually have that morale buff in place. I don't think it would matter too much when you're talking about taking direct artillery hits in the way that the Goblins and Mountain Uruks have been, but still, that is worth bearing in mind. Rhun just about managing to salvage that situation. This man's technically breaking through that initial front line, but they don't have enough to really consolidate at all, and Rhun will be able to put them back in their box pretty fast. Oof. Again, another direct hit. I don't know how many kills the Dragon's Breath will end up with come the end of the battle, but it will definitely be a substantial amount. And the White Orc Fearmongers routing as well. Routing into the settlement. With enough of them, they could return, so that could prove to be a headache later on. Let's see if Numenor are having better luck now. Tribal Levy Spears on the way forward. This Numenorian front line holding in a steadfast manner so far. It's over here, though, where more yardage has been made by the attackers. Can Rhudaur keep this up? Swordsman going up against the Cohort and Shield Guard, and then the Arthedain Shadow Bows firing down from on high as well. The Rangers, also another class of unit which surely will be reaping a bloody harvest indeed. It should be fine for the moment, Numenor, but they have taken losses, and it's a question of how much they have in reserve. I mean, it's possible, of course, that Rhun could siphon off some of their resources to help out now that they can get away with maybe slightly less against the Misty Mountains. That may have to be how things go, but the Rhovanion now putting some pressure on this kind of token force from the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains. I mean, when you consider Hoplons and Arthedain pikemen, the pikemen are really... It'll take them a while to get through, of course, not the highest in terms of damage, but it's going to be difficult for the Blue Mountains to force these humans back out of the settlement without some sort of ranged support. And now also the Rovikin phalanx moving forward, so doubling down on their pike presence. Although I don't actually think these pikes are... Oh no, they are. A couple of them are in melee anyway. These Wardens of Thorin's Halls, 97 of them, dual wielding those axes. They fancied their chances against the Hoplons in a straight fight. Now, pikes getting involved, frost spears, top of the hill. Meanwhile over here they are firing away with those frost spears now, firing away at the Dunedain Troll Slayers, although it looks like they've been cut down by the Wardens of the North. You can see some of the armour-piercing arrows landing about them, some standard arrows as well from the marksmen, so Arthedain certainly know how much of a problem these frost spears could be if left unchecked, and immediately dealing with them. The frost spears trying to kill off as many of these Dunedain troll slayers as they possibly can before they inevitably fall at this point. Troll slayers also doing their thing from afar. Troll slayers have got their unique animations with those spears as well, which does make them very effective against trolls by all accounts, but we haven't actually seen that as of yet, and this won't be the battle where we see that for the first time either. No trolls in the defenders' ranks. Juggernauts still doing that taunting animation. They're not fully in melee at this point. Front line looking a little bit splintered. Ruins of Thorin's Halls moving forward as well. I mean, solid enough, the dwarves, but the numbers of Arthedain unwavering at the moment. That's the difference really between Arthedain's attempts to break through in the Misty Mountains. Arthedain haven't taken crippling casualties yet, which means they can still turn up the heat on the dwarves should the need arise. Marksman of Thorin's Halls now in position where the frost spears were. Not as damaging, of course, but at the very least still offering a good bit of support. And they've got a decent arc of fire as well, of course. Archers can be used a little bit more easily in this sort of situation. Arthedain with that armour and those shields from the front will absorb a decent amount of that damage, but not all of it. Ooh. These frost spears, meanwhile, in a very good position indeed. The repeaters hitting into this mass again. It's not high damage projectiles individually, but it's the rate of fire, consistent flow of damage. And this is a problem for this little Rhovanion force. They're not going to be able to break through the Dwarven infantry quickly enough, I think, and already even the upper echelon of their Roverkin units are starting to become shaken amid the hailstorm of projectiles they're now facing. More of their tribal units over here, maybe a little bit more likely to break through. Numenor, Balagai units starting to rout off. Their numbers slightly more in question after the opening salvos in this fight than their allies. Still the cohort is a little bit more hodgepodge as well, like I said. Arthedain Shadowbows taking hits from throwing axes. Trollshore axe throwers doing the business against them very nicely. Again, this probably need to reorganise. It might even be time to retreat from this first layer for the defenders. Maybe set up a new defensive position. They've got some good choke points they can take advantage of. They can cover their retreat more easily with archers as well, which is a bit of a luxury in a settlement. But for now, content to keep fighting, trying to cut down more of these men of Rhudaur. Trollshore axe throwers now getting involved in the skirmish.
Only half the enemy force remains.
Forward come the Naru Sentinel, so yeah, definitely content to try and hold on to this opening layer. Will that prove to be a mistake on Numenor's part? I think it may very well be, considering that the Rhovanion are now moving in to support Rhudaur, getting their slingers into position, doing some damage to the infantry units that are still trying to hold on to these positions. Good damage. They won't do well in melee, of course, these slingers, but it's all about efficiency for the attackers. Slingers still being utilised. Durin's Warborn charging in as well. Still some Frost Spear damage, although they have moved a bit. Oh no, that's the depleted unit. They must have retreated the other unit of Frost Spears, as there are no corpses over there. So they must be future-proofing. They must be moving their units around, and Durin's Warborn charging in, getting what kills they can. Up here. Marksman of Thorin's Halls trying to rout Arthedain clearly by using fire arrows. I mean, the High Thanes are in melee as well. They don't have to retreat from this position, of course, because it only leads to the second layer anyway. They have got other units moving back, but can Arthedain actually make their way through here? Dunedain Rangers, out of ammunition, drawing their axes. That armour-piercing heft will be much appreciated, I'm sure, but Juggernauts and High Thanes are the opposition. Arthedain may still hold the numbers advantage, but it scarcely gets more difficult as far as a melee foe goes. Let's see. Still moving in with extra forces for the Rhovanion. Durin's Warborn still making a nuisance of themselves. Rhudaur nobles taking hits from armour-piercing projectiles of the Numenorian steel bowmen, wanting to try and deal with any sort of potential the attackers may have of using high damage cavalry. There is enough room within the interior of the settlement for that sort of manoeuvring, although the terrain being so steep does not help cavalry's case, at least when you're going uphill. Of course, downhill, like that, will help out quite a lot. The Trollshire axe throwers getting crunched by the Warborn. Like being under direct throwing axe fire, mind you. Meanwhile, the Misty Mountains still clinging on to some sort of competitiveness in this battle. The Carmel Shadow Bows engaging these Snaga. They're down to really their last dregs, the Misty Mountains, of trying to keep this assault alive. Defeat seems certain. Scion Rim on the way forwards as well. One cave troll drummer, so they did move forward eventually. But now it's a case of trying to use those Snaga javelins and the Goblin Kingsguard, and that's pretty much all they have left. I mean, the Kingsguard, how many of them are there? 57 against 91 Scion Rim. It's a close fight, that. Scion Rim are defensive enough to be able to withstand pressure from a bodyguard unit like that, although it will be a close run thing. But it does mean, of course, that Rhun can start moving off units elsewhere. Golden Raiders, Gamperum as well. Maybe they're not moving off as many units as I would have thought they should. Steel Bowman. Heard the squish of artillery, but it's not Dragon's Breath this time, it's elsewhere. Durin's Warborn. I think I heard the sounds of the charge, otherwise we'd have missed that. Tribal Levy Slingers. And they're not charging into anything too deadly, the Warborn, but they are keeping their kill count ticking over quite nicely for a unit so expensive, which of course if you're the defenders and you're bringing very expensive cavalry like that, you need to make it worth your while. Gaining that value slowly but surely. Occasional frost spear shots still arcing over and hitting these Rhovanion units. So the barbarian catapult, that's where the attacking artillery was, but they have managed to secure the entryway of the settlement here. Are they also going to be able to force their way through over here and start laying siege to the second layer from all angles? I mean, maybe. Marksman Thorin's Hall's now out of ammunition, being added to melee, trying to make Arthedain's life as difficult as possible. The numbers would still favour Arthedain by the looks of it, but they're relying really on Troll Slayers and Rangers. I mean, they do have the Defenders of Fornost in here as well, up to a little bit more than their fellows perhaps, but still going up against the braced halberds of the High Thanes. Like I said in the deployment phase, the High Thanes have been the most consistently high performing unit the Blue Mountains have had in all of the battles we've seen them in. Juggernauts have done pretty well as well, but I think the combination of a javelin and a halberd, very unique combination, as we also said. Closest thing would be the Gatekeepers of Cardland crossbow halberd combination. Yeah, big damage, and of course armour piercing damage as well, which Arthedain won't be big fans of, considering the makeup of their attacking force here. Defeat seems like a possibility now with the Troll Slayers managing to get in and around them. I think the numbers might be enough here in the long run. It's just a question of whether or not that was all worth it, considering this is pretty much the entirety of Arthedain's force that they have left, and it's not much. It's not a complete defeat like the Misty Mountains will suffer at Rhune's hands, but it's going to be tough. And they've still got high ticket units and dangerous skirmishers as well, Frost Spears and Dragon's Wrath crossbowmen waiting for them menacingly. Still some dwarves actually down here, so they're still contesting the outer layer. Warns of Thorin's Halls doing their thing. for how much longer. Still content to sort of wait, I suppose. I think they're probably waiting for Arthedain to have their victory so that there is at least another angle that the attackers are approaching at. Because of course that is certainly not going to be the case any longer for the Misty Mountains. They're still fighting, but there's no chance that they break through the golden lines any longer. Still that one troll. Panicking a little bit, bless him. Amongst the corpses of his dead brethren. The Kingsguard themselves, though, made of sterner stuff, physically and mentally, than many of their goblin fellows. Gamprim. Numenor still have a few of these Arthedain shadow bows. Don't know how much ammunition they necessarily have. Steel bows as well, of course. Another dangerous skirmisher, though their more limited ammunition pool means that maybe the attackers won't be quite so worried about them. Firing away. Rhovakin nobles, I think, the target. Bodyguard tier. Still fighting against something. Shadow bows. Finished off by a small gang of slingers. There's a lot of surface area for the defenders to have to cover here, which if the attackers can leverage their numbers, they can swamp over them, but that's maybe where the extreme angle of the settlement comes in. Still the High Thanes fighting, and victory seems certain for them again now as well, now that the flanking force of Troll Slayers are there. Still 7 Frost Spears trying to do their thing. The Dwarven General does fall at the hands of those pikes. Again, the dwarves are made of stern stuff, though. Loss of a general is not quite the tragedy it is for them as it would be for a force like the Misty Mountains, who I'm sure will see the death of their general any moment, considering the situation that they're in. Thorns are still defenders of the Blue Mountains. Arthedain running out of steam, really, and meanwhile hoping to get some support here from the Rhovanion nobles. I think the lance cavalry of the attackers is going to struggle to be super efficient. I mean, the Durin's Warborn have certainly played their part, nibbling away at the manpower reserves of the attackers as the battle's gone on. Yeah, Arthedain are going to run out of steam here. I mean, charging in here are the Rhovanion, actually managing to land a decent charge there into the High Thanes, and many of them falling, in fact tumbling in terms of numbers. A very nice charge. And it's a risky thing to do, of course, as well, because the High Thanes, being halberds, are capable of doing extreme damage to cavalry very, very quickly. But now that they're braced, that could be a real difference maker. Again, it's much the same sort of... Arthedain may win as a result of these charges from the Rhovanion, but it's one of the most Pyrrhic victories you're ever likely to see, and it's not going to be a substantial force at all that makes its way over here. And, well, Dragon's Wrath crossbows are ready and waiting anyway. Wouldn't take too many volleys, I think, to see them off. Still the Wardens of Thorin's Halls. I don't know what Rhudaur and the Rhovanions' plan is from here. They're not really going to receive any sort of support from their allies from the flanks at all. The longer they leave it, though, it means that the defenders can reposition all of their assets to face Rhudaur and the Rhovanion head on. Which means... probably means defeat for the attackers, honestly, if that is allowed to transpire. Barbarian catapults are sort of squished in with one another. They may end up destroying one of their own artillery pieces as a result of this. I mean, I'm going to try and bank their shots into those Frost Spears and Carmel's Chosen. Too tempting a target to pass up. Will they hit?
It is coming for us.
Yes. Not devastating yet, but they did manage to hit the Carmel's Chosen, if nothing else. What's happening with this Goblin General then? Still alive. The General is, anyway. Is he the last one? He is. Nope, he's got one of his bodyguards remaining. This goes to show how slowly spears tend to do damage, even a higher tier one like the Scion Rim. Keep knocking him over. It's only a matter of time though before one of these blows strikes true. Surely. He is now on his own, is he not? No. It's kind of hard to tell. His bodyguard is... Oh, now he is. Slowly and surely. The spear malice at work. Eager and exhausted. The general's still eager for combat, in spite of how poorly this battle has gone for the Misty Mountains. Let's go to show how the general models have heightened stats though as well. It's one of the reasons why you often do want to put your general in a strong unit, because the general takes on the characteristics of the unit. He's just a bit tougher. If you put him in a Nazgul, for example, you're going to have basically an extra very strong Nazgul, whereas if you put him in, you can put them in, and we have seen them be put into very basic units like Snaga skirmishers and such, but then the general is essentially just a very slightly more resilient Snaga skirmisher. Not exactly the last word in terms of quality. Now that is not what I was expecting. I was sure the next general to fall would have been this guy, but instead the Numenorian general. A banking shot from that catapult. I mean, you're asking for trouble. You've seen the Carmel's chosen already get sniped out. If you pass through this area, you're taking that risk, and the risk did not pay off for Joey, his Royal Legion of Armenelos, and that was a fair few of them as well that died in that. Arpharazon unceremoniously killed, and also the Frost Spears getting hit as well. So that Barbarian catapult definitely proved its worth. Meanwhile, the attack has begun on the front here, although Numenorian steel bows, the ones manning the front lines initially. Decent in melee, which is a good thing as well, given their limited ammunition. They need to have that multifaceted nature if they're going to be a unit worth bringing. It's a bit of a, again, maybe a little bit undercooked, this defensive position. Rhudaur and Rhovanion Sentinels and Gamperim coming in will help to turn that around into the final 10k frame, so I don't think we're going to see the very summit of the settlement come into play at all. I think it will be a case of the second layer is where the battle will be won and lost. Dragon's Wrath crossbows. I mean, they have that extreme terrain advantage, meaning their range is going to be absolutely massive. They can pick and choose, really, what their targets are. Numenorian steel bows were around the other side. That has to be the Misty Mountains general, surely. The Golden Raiders were what it took to finally finish him off. And that means, well, Arthedain technically victorious, but this is the entirety of their army now. Not really an army, is it? It's like one of those armies you see a Mountain Blade, which is just like 12 dudes running around. Concentrating their efforts on this one choke point as well, perhaps sensing the fact that their manpower reserves are getting a little bit low, and wanting to maybe bunch the defenders up as well so their catapult can do more of that heavy lifting. Bit of support coming in from the Rovikin archers as well, hoping to chip away at the defenders. Quality of units like the Rhudaur and Rhovanion Sentinels is still going to be a problem, as much as they were hit by the catapults as well. The Carmel's Chosen and Royal Legion of Armenelos still have or offer that quality spike. The problem with focusing on one choke point though is it does leave more angles open for attack. Some skirmishers outside the settlement, but the Golden Raiders getting in the way of the Barbarian catapult, but those spears will prove to be a problem. Golden Raiders are not on the same level as the Durin's Warborn or the Rhovanion cavalry that we've seen. Flanking around with a pretty decent force this, and pretty decent force in terms of quality as well. All those bodyguard units I just mentioned. They're going to take some hits on the approach from these archers, but that will not bother them too much, I don't think. Ooh, Rhudaun Nobles though, I think they actually pulled out of that charge, which is a bit of a shame. Pharism Swordmasters, another high quality unit that are going to have to be dealt with. Rhudaun on the way across. I mean, there's not really any anti-cavalry here. The Golden Raiders' crossbows would be the closest thing, but I think pretty sure they've used all their ammunition. The Rhovanion, I would suggest, by far the healthiest force of attackers still on the field, and Tribal Berserkers going to be coming in here, offering up that damage. Frost Spears of Azagal. I mean, they will need to dump their ammunition here. They are going to need an extra boost to the defenders of damage, because otherwise the damage in melee and of course the damage from afar as well, these slingers, it will start to add up for the defenders, and they do have a somewhat limited force still remaining to them. Is this flanking force truly the best idea? Tribal Berserkers, I mean, they're taking an absolute beating, the Royal Legion now. Those tribal skirmishers that have come forward. Golden Raiders, once again having another nibble at the Barbarian Catapult, but this will probably end up being the end for them if they can't get out of there quickly. Carmel's Chosen moving around, I mean, the Royal Legion. I mean, the Pharism Swordmasters should butcher their way through the Catapult crew. Again, another clattering charge from the Rhudaun Nobles, this time into the Carmel's Chosen. They've, I mean, towards the tail end of this fight, they've definitely proven to be a pretty substantial factor in this fight. That was, well, the Dragon's Breath Cannon again, getting a direct hit into the Tribal Levy Skirmishers. I think as a single unit goes, if the defenders do go on to win this, the Dragon's Breath is possibly the reason why. The horrendous damage they did to the Misty Mountains earlier are now still contributing late on against a unit that was proven to be a bit of a problem for those Royal Legion. This flanking force so far hasn't really proven to be... If they had some anti-cavalry to prevent the Rhudaun Nobles from doing as they pleased, it would be a different story maybe, but a downhill charge, lances down, yeah, and unsurprisingly the Runic General falls as a result of that. Maybe the most significant defensive general as well. Rhun are more likely to rout as a result of everything going wrong. Golden Raiders will try to prevent the Rhudaun Nobles from leaving. Rhudaun Nobles making a nuisance of themselves as well, so this attacking cavalry late on. I did mention earlier how they hadn't really been all that effective, but late on they could be the difference here. Dragon's Wrath Guildsman following through with that charge as well. That's where the Runic General is also. That is brutal. Projectiles bouncing off as a result of the terrain around them, but again, this is the sort of thing which brought about the end of the Misty Mountains. It may very well bring about the end of the Rhovanion as well, in conjunction with the Frost Spear fire which is continuing, getting their berserkers out of there. Vicious. Maybe less of a venomous charge that, but still certainly proving to be one of the more effective attacking units here late on, the Rhudaun Nobles. Still the small matter of those Witch-Realm Enslavers. Tribal Levy Slingers trying to do their thing. Pharism Swordmasters now getting mobbed by several units, but that's a bit unfortunate. Most of that was friendly fire, somehow threading the needle to hit their own units. Probably the first example of the Dragon's Breath disgracing itself, really. Most of the examples throughout this battle so far have been incredibly positive from their point of view. Rhudaun Nobles still hovering around. Getting a good hit this time, although most of that was on the Barbarian Catapult crew, I think, but they may need that Dragon's Breath though to keep doing the kind of damage that it has throughout the battle. I mean, it's the kind of performance, there goes the Arthedain General. That might be Arthedain's final death rattle, but it wouldn't surprise me, honestly, if the Dragon's Breath crew, by the time this battle is over, we won't see it, of course, because we're not seeing it from Rhune's perspective, but it must be close to the 1,000 kill mark, considering it was the Misty Mountains they got direct hits on. The crew itself in melee could yet prove to be very, very important as well. Rhudaur and Nobles now. Probably the battle of the two most effective units from both sides in this battle, but as we mentioned in melee, the Golden Raiders still going to make life more difficult. They are, you know, lance cavalry as well, the Rhudaur and Nobles, so in pure melee terms, certainly against infantry, they're not going to be all that effective. Just trying to stop the artillery from firing at this point. I mean, it's better late than never, I suppose, but the horrendous damage that the cannon has inflicted in this battle. Frost spears now getting involved in melee as well. More of the Numenorians moving in. I think this attack is starting to fizzle out. I mean, I did notice as well there's still the Sapphire Bladesmen over there, having to deal with the Rhudaur Nobles, but they surely will. And that's another decent melee combatant as well late on. Good damage. Just the Rhudaur general now that remains. I think, based on what I saw, I think the Rhovanion general was in one of the units of archers. And we kind of lost track of him. The javelins are still over here again. The Dragon's Breath crew getting another good hit, this time quality over quantity, hitting the Witch Realm Enslavers. Probably one of the best performances from a single piece of artillery that we've seen in a long time, this. And probably the best we've ever seen the Dragon's Breath do as well. Can be a little bit of a temperamental thing, as most artillery can be, but it's kind of less user-friendly than a ballista, but it needs similar conditions to be able to work. Clear sight lines and that, but I guess, well, we've seen certainly here in this battle that its ceiling is higher in terms of the damage it can do, physically and psychologically, to the opposition. Now look at that, Hidden is now playing Medieval 2, and he is the one at the wheel of Rhun in this battle as well. Still moving through though, still with numbers in reserve, the Rhovanion able to, again, I don't know how much of that was friendly fire, but it certainly hit the opposition once more. It's a good thing the Rhovanian's general is still alive, honestly, because I think if they weren't, a lot of these tribal units would be routing at this point. So the fact that that is still the case. Rhovican archers, is this the unit that had the general in? I saw him from far, I think. It's not him, that's just a standard officer, because the general has got the wings that the nobles have. That's him, I believe. Still lives. He's definitely in harm's way here, though. Down in these ditches. Huge bombards. So that's it, I think, for the Dragon's Breath cannon in terms of... Some defenders of 4 not stuck there now. It's a little bit chaotic. I mean, surely the defenders are the deserving victors here, given the ridiculous performance of those artillery. But it does go to show, if the attackers do go on to win this, the wasteful nature perhaps early on of Numenor in the opening section of the settlement. There goes the Rhudaur general. I don't think Rhudaur have got that much left anyway. It's the Rhovanion that are the true threat. Which are Enslavers, the only thing that... Well, and the Reforged Javelins, but they're two higher end Rhudaur units that the loss of a general won't cause them to instantly rout anyway. Yeah, maybe if the attackers do go on to win this, it is because of the performance. Oh no, they still have... Ooh, friendly fire there. Not sure it's that worth it this late on, but it hit the Reforged Javelins as well. Goodness me. Still 55 of them. More of them than the Witch Realm Enslavers. Dragon's Breath Guildsmen buying some extra time for maybe more artillery goodness. And you say the Rhovican nobles as well. Or Rhoviran nobles, I should say. Going to try and get some point-blank action. I don't know if the Enslavers have got the numbers to be able to do this, but at the very least they'll finally be silencing the artillery. It's in the dying embers of this fight. Surrounded as they are, though, the formation is not going to be coming into effect either. Did they have the quality? I mean, they did have a decent amount of these Not the tribal levy skirmishers, but tribal berserkers. Still got some slingers as well in high numbers. Not the highest quality units from the Rhovanion, but they have the numbers to be able to see the attacks across the line here, and I think Red Knight has played very well. Definitely biding his time nicely. It will be the efforts of Rhudaur and the Rhovanion that will be to thank if the attackers do manage to get themselves over the line here. Again, should have retreated a little sooner, I think, the defenders, and then they would have been in a slightly better position. It's also kind of an imperceptible thing. We don't know, like, throwing projectiles and skirmishing and all of that. It's harder to keep track of that from a visual standpoint in battles like this. And slingers and skirmishers and javelins and axe throwers from Rhudaur, all the sort of thing which could have been making life very, very difficult for the defenders. Numenor in particular, of course, because they had to deal with it the most. So there are mitigating circumstances, of course, as there always are.
Our army is running from the field. We must rally our men before all
There goes the dwarves. I think the attackers have got it, you know. Looking at this. Yeah, there's simply too many of the attackers remaining. Rhudaur and Rhovanion doing a fantastic job considering the horrendous beating that the Misty Mountains took in this battle. That's a pretty good performance from the attackers. Like, usually the attackers, when they outnumber defenders, it's not really too noteworthy if they go on to win, really. But I think considering the circumstances in this battle, it actually is pretty impressive. Maybe less impressive performances from the Frost Spears than we would have been hoping for, but we will see the kills on them, so I guess if they did get kills that we simply didn't see, we'll be able to figure that out momentarily, but narrow attacker victory once more, by the look of it. Come the Rovikin phalanx. Tribal heavy spears also getting to the summit of the hill. I mean, rather fittingly, the last standing defending unit will be the Dragon's Breath crew, trying to get some extra kills for their count here in the late game against the tribal levy units. They'll definitely be able to do that. Berserkers, I mean, the extra damage that the Berserkers afforded in that late game, also another factor in favour of the Rhovanion late on. Barbarian catapults as well. Slingers on the way forward. Not a huge amount left, but yeah, 2% is the difference, and that is pretty understandable. It's mostly entry-level tribal units in the Rhovanion that remain as well, like the occasion, well, 7 Witchhelm enslavers, but I don't know if they're going to survive to the end of this battle. The Dragon's Breath crew might, at least 1 or 2 of them will survive from this. So there will be a bodyguard unit left standing to a certain extent, but yeah, again, maybe if they got fortunate and killed the Rhovanion general and more of those tribal units had started routing, the numbers would have betrayed the attackers in the end. But in the end, the one general that maybe they needed to kill the defenders is the one that ended up surviving the onslaught. Yeah, it is what it is, I guess. Barbarian catapult. I mean, as well, you know, as much as the defending artillery was certainly outstanding, the attacking artillery managed to get some good, accurate hits. There goes the Dragon's Breath crew. Vengeance has been taken. There is still some sort of defending unit elsewhere, apparently. Tribal levy skirmishers fighting something.
We have nothing to be ashamed of.
That was it.
It was but a cruel twist of fate that snatched victory from our
Very good game, that. Very competitive. Very varied as well. I think everyone had some sort of significant victory, and everyone, bar maybe the Rhovanion, actually had some sort of significant defeat. Or Rhun maybe as well later on. I mean, overall, of course, they lost, but yeah, interesting indeed. I mean, to be fair to the Misty Mountains, in spite of the huge damage they were clearly taking, they actually got a fair amount of kills out of that. So again, stuff like javelins and crossbows were probably more to be thanked for that than anything else. Maybe the trolls as well, of course. Even when the infantry was getting crushed all around them, trolls are still going to be able to do a good amount of damage in a short amount of time. But yeah, in spite of getting one of the fewer amounts of kills among his contemporaries, I think Red Knight's late game play alongside the damage that Rhudaur were able to do, certainly that central position I think was where the attackers won it. Arthedain with fewer kills, but then they were going up against a smaller dwarven army. It was tough for them as well. Like I said, Numenor maybe positionally should have retreated back a little bit sooner, but that's a harsh assessment to give really in a chaotic fight like that. But again, maybe knowing exactly when to retreat. It's again the margins that you have to work with as defenders in 3v4s or especially 3v5s of course are very, very fine indeed. So let's see what did the damage for the dwarves. High Thanes 416 again, performing very, very well. The Frostspears actually did do a good job. So consistent damage, which is good to see. 229 is a good return. 466 is an excellent return. The Juggernauts, considering the kind of fight they were in, which should really have been ideal for them. I mean, 210 is okay, but considering the the necessity that the defenders have for all of their high tier units to really perform, I don't think 157 is actually that acceptable, given that it was mostly rank and file Arthedainians they were facing off against. And when you spend that much on a unit, 157, mostly basic kills, is not enough. Dwarven Miners, just to pad out the army, so not too bad there. Defenders of the Blue Mountains. Marksmen of the Thorin's Halls, good amount of kills over the long haul. And the Durin's Warborn, racking up a very good kill count for themselves across the field, though, of course, the Rhovirim nobles and Arthedain nobles also did the same, so the cavalry stakes really, I think, were relatively even. In fact, considering the time of the battle that it came in, I think the Rhovirim nobles probably, even if they got less kills, were probably more impactful than the Durin's Warborn, but still, very good use of defensive cavalry, and that's what you have to do. If you're going to bring expensive cavalry as the defenders, that's the kind of numbers you need to be seeing, and that's what Tommy was able to achieve. So yes, shame we can't see what did the damage for Hidden, because of course that we would have been able to see a pretty ludicrous amount of kills, I think, from the Dragon's Breath, but in the end not quite enough. And like I said, maybe a bit of routing from the tribals could have been induced if the Rhovanion general had fallen, but he kept himself alive, the one general that manages to live through the battle here. But yeah, big thank you to Tommy for sending this one in. Big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. Kind of, like I said, a settlement that's a little bit different because of the terrain that it's on. And yeah, I think Tommy sent me one more. I need to make my way through a backlog here because there is a little mini update which has happened in the tournament build, but I can't update until I've worked my way through the backlog, otherwise everything will be incompatible, especially seeing as the Blue Mountains were one of the main movers and shakers in that patch, so a battle like this obviously would have been greatly affected because the Blue Mountains were one of the main characters, but yeah, we'll see. I think there's 2 or 3 battles I still have to make my way through on this version before I can update, so we'll see how I organise that, but we've got to get through all of them before moving on. And then of course the tournament has entered its knockout stage, so we will be getting towards the tail end of that. I hope that once the tournament is over we'll be starting to talk about concrete release dates. That's my great hope, but we'll see about that. Again, I'm waffling though, so we'll end things here. Big thank you to Tommy and all the players once again. Hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.